My gosh, we're so honored. We're so grateful to the Chief Justice for her visit and, of course, to President Burcham. So we're starting off on a great note. Before speaking further, I want to express deep gratitude to Joe Hellige, who is the Chief Academic Officer of this university and our host. He's the host of the Bellarmine Forum. And also I want to mention our gratitude to Professor Kevin Peters and to Cheryl Bush, who have been our helpers and support. We couldn't have done this event without them, so we thank them very much. Good morning. And a warm welcome. Warm welcome to another way, imagining the future of a justice that restores. What kinds of universities, with what emphases and what directions would we run if we were refounding the Society of Jesus in today's world? That's the question raised by Jesuit General Adolfo Nicolas. And so as we gather here on the centennial of Loyola Marymount University, we're invited to join the Bellarmine Forum conversation as this entire academic community strives to come up with an answer. So we are here to provide our answer to that question. Father Nicholas wants us to start at the beginning, which reminds me of the time that I was reading to my 5-year-old grandson, paging through the book, and suddenly he interrupted me. He says, "Grandpa, what's wrong with your hand?" I looked at my hand, and suddenly I saw what he noticed. I said, "Well, honey, nothing's wrong with my hand. Those are wrinkles. Grandpa is old." And he looked at me and says, "Well, how old are you?" "I'm 67. He cocked his head. He said, "Grandpa, did you start at 1? So, yeah. Father Nicholas wants us to start at 1. Before we can imagine the future of a justice that restores, we need to start at 1 in looking back, at least briefly, at the Ignatian tradition, and second, the first 100 years of LMU. The Ignatian tradition began in the restless heart of a wealthy young Basque, a prideful and impetuous would-be knight living in a castle in northern Spain. It was the 16th century. Inigo de Loyola was inclined to violence. He loved the romance of battle. More than that, later in life, he admitted that he had also been a ladies' man, a swashbuckler full of machismo. In 1521, when he was 29, a cannonball nearly destroyed his leg in the Battle of Pamplona. And this seeming disaster put Ignatius on a different road. During his year-long recuperation, through hours of spiritual reading and silent reflection, he discovered himself. He was slowly drawn to become the man that God wanted him to be. His leg was never the same, nor were the goals for his life. In 1522, he finally limped out of the castle. He went on a spiritual retreat, and he made a vow to God to change his life, to give his life to God. And he spent most of the next 20 years as a pilgrim. His life was marked by reflection and discernment, by the very slow writing of the famous track for spiritual directors, the spiritual exercises, and constant study, first in Spanish universities and finally at the great University of Paris, where he earned a master's degree in theology. The charismatic Ignatius gathered a circle around him at Paris. He directed them in the spiritual exercises. And in 1540 in Rome, this little group became a religious order, the Society of Jesus, the first 10 Jesuits. And they found themselves in a world that looks a lot like ours. filled with warfare, religious conflicts, and extremes of poverty and wealth. The first Jesuits headed out into that world looking for God in all things. So in Rome, their first work was with girls and women who were driven by poverty into prostitution. They worked with the poorest of the poor. And they tried to live out Ignatius's teaching that love ought to show itself in deeds more than in words. They embraced a spiritual practice of reflecting consciously every day on how the Spirit was moving their hearts to be a person for others. The Jesuits' first principle and foundation, this is their start at one, is the core belief that God who loves us gave us life. Our own response of love allows God's life to flow into us without limit. So seeking it to respond to the gift of life with love, Jesuits seek to be single-minded and single-hearted in the service of others. And they do that without regard to the cost to themselves. So the first principle and foundation also states, we should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. For everything has a potential of calling forth in us a deeper response to our life in God. So, although entry into the Jesuit order required solemn vows of selflessness, poverty, chastity, obedience, the Jesuits grew dramatically. So at their first 100-year mark, they had over 15,000 members laboring around the world. In higher education alone, by their 100-year mark, they had founded and were running over 400 universities and colleges across Europe, in Japan, in India, Philippines, and in the Americas. So the 6 Jesuits who founded this university in 1911 brought with them a 4-century-old Ignatian tradition. LMU's started one. So LMU's started one, happened in a couple of old broken down houses down the hill and across the way in Highland Park in East LA. After a few years there, the university moved to Venice Boulevard down the hill, the current site of Loyola High School. By 1920, the university had added a law school, Loyola Law School, founded in 1920. I'd like to make a special point here. When Loyola Law School opened, many Los Angeles social and civic institutions were not welcoming to Catholics or Jews. Loyola Law School was the first in Los Angeles to welcome Jewish students, and it did so from the very first day. So the interfaith dialogue and the collaboration that we see here today is a value of this institution from the earliest days. 1928, the university, except the downtown law school, moved to this hilltop. Here, Loyola University was comprised of 2 buildings, a building for the Jesuits and a classroom building. I've often thought that only the Jesuits would have the self-confidence, our Jewish friends would say chutzpah, to call 2 little buildings a university. But university it was, and it grew, especially after World War II, when returning veterans attended Loyola University in large numbers thanks to the GI Bill. By the 1950s, as the civil rights movement changed our nation, this university became a beacon for social justice in Los Angeles. I was privileged to attend Loyola University in the 1960s when Father Charles Casassa was still the president. And among his many famous accomplishments in the area of social justice, Father Casassa started the university's Human Relations Workshop. He started that in the early 50s to teach racial justice and civil rights to teachers, police, city officials. That workshop program endured for 25 years. Also in the 1950s, the university became home to the very first Mexican-American Students Association. After the Watts riots in 1965, Father Casassa served on the City of Los Angeles Commission formed to discover the causes of that riot and to make recommendations for changes in city governance and policing. As the 1960s became the 70s, the university added a dozen buildings, and it also continued maturing as its student body began to look more and more like the population of Los Angeles. And certainly the high water mark of this university was 1973. After 5 years of partnership that Father Casassa negotiated with the all-women's Marymount College, the two schools merged to form Loyola Marymount University. And obviously, women have made all the difference in this university. They are now the majority. They are the majority in Westchester. They're the majority at Loyola Law School. They are outstanding students and student leaders, but more than that, women are brilliant professors at this university, deans, and administrators. The gender equity at LMU is matched by other gains in diversity, racial, ethnic, and even religious. So, in 2000, then President Father Robert Lawton celebrated the religious diversity of LMU, saying, "Those of us who are Catholic benefit enormously from the presence of people whose ways of viewing God and the world are far different from our own. Such people question our cliches, shake our categories, stretch our imaginations, and touch our hearts. God is far too big, and God's world is far too intricately textured to be exhausted by the insights of any one tradition, religious or intellectual, or even by the sum of all traditions." Father Lawton was prophetic. Here, only 12 years later, LMU is led by President David Burcham, a non-Jesuit, a non-Catholic, and LMU is blessed. Our new president is a superb lawyer, a gifted teacher of constitutional law, and someone who left his mark of excellence on Loyola Law School, where he was a great dean for 8 years. We miss him terribly at the law school. President Burcham, he stretches our imagination, he touches our hearts, and most importantly, President Burcham challenges everyone in this academic community to live up to Ignatian values and to be a person for others. So, we start at 1 today. Today, through our panels, through your questions, your comments, your coffee time conversations, we'll try to answer Father Nicolas's question, not only on behalf of Loyola Law School, but on behalf of everyone who imagines a justice that restores. Now, if Father Nicolas is like most people that I've talked to about restorative justice, he will say something like, "That sounds wonderful. What is restorative justice?" So I've given fresh thought to my answer, especially in this context, here at the Bellarmine Forum celebrating LMU's centennial. I want to connect restorative justice to the Ignatian tradition, but also to the values of those whose ways of viewing God and the world may be far different from Catholic ways. But as I see it, no matter how you view God, the heart of restorative justice values are the same. I agree with the respected theologian, Father Ronald Rolheiser, who teaches that every major religious tradition embraces the same 4 essentials: respect, graciousness, forgiveness, love. It occurs to me that these are the same essentials that undergird restorative justice: respect for victims survivors, offenders, every person impacted by crime. Graciousness, meaning showing gratitude for the gift of life through kindness and through service. Forgiveness, God's universal gift, ours to accept and ours to offer. And love, the kind that St. Ignatius said ought to show itself in deeds more than in words. So let me illustrate these essentials with a story that I heard from a first-year student right here at LMU, Frankie Carrillo. And Frankie, could you please stand? Frankie, whom many of you know, is no ordinary freshman. He is 37 years old, and he spent the last 20 years of his life in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Last March, great lawyers established his total innocence in court. And although adversaries, these lawyers worked cooperatively in the spirit of restorative justice to give Frankie back his life. And I want to recognize the lawyers, some of those lawyers who are here with us today. So first, Deputy State Public Defender Ellen Eggers. Ellen, would you please stand? Please stand. Ellen was Frankie's main defense lawyer. We're joined by and honored with the presence of Deputy District Attorney Bill Hodgman. Bill. Bill's son Alec is an LMU senior. And Deputy District Attorney Juan Mejia. Juan is an LMU alum and a former student body president. The law school is going to recognize Juan Mejia with its Ignatian Award next month. So mark your calendars, March 15th. I'll see you at the law school. We'll have a great time. Okay, so here's the story from Frankie. This is a story that Frankie told me. When Frankie was in Folsom Prison during the last 5 years of his confinement, he created the welcoming cell. You see, he had noticed that Folsom was a stopping point for men sentenced to relatively short terms, often less than a year or so. They were confined at Folsom for a few days or maybe a couple of weeks while they were then transferred to another prison to serve out these terms. But Folsom was reserved, as always, for lifers, for men serving long sentences. And these people had no respect for the short-timers. Maybe the short-timers were too fresh or too willing to talk about things on the outside. The lifers didn't want to hear those stories. The men in the general population shunned the short-timers, and worse, they subjected them to insults and abuse. They were not welcome. Observing this, Frankie went to Smitty, who was the housing clerk, and he asked him to assign the new guys to his cell. So when the new man arrived, Frankie was ready. He had prepared a hot meal. He had wrapped a gift, usually a new pair of shoes or a shirt, and he gave the man a warm welcome. But more than that, he listened to his story. Frankie recalls that many of these men eventually told him that he was the first person that they had ever opened up to about their lives. Restorative justice calls those conversations in Frankie's welcoming cell victim-offender dialogue. Frankie, the victim of a criminal justice system that was at that very time in the process of stealing his life, showed those offenders respect, graciousness, forgiveness, and love. Now maybe that story will explain to Father Nicolas how we imagine a justice that restores. But he's a very worldly and eminently practical man. He speaks 6 languages. He has a doctorate in theology. and he was a professor in Japan for 30 years. So he may still wonder how these essentials, especially love, can be a part of the criminal justice system. Perhaps I should answer Father Nicolas with the words of his predecessor, Father Pedro Arrupe, the Jesuit general during the turbulent 60s. Father Arrupe is credited with these famous words: "Nothing is more practical than finding God. That is, than falling in love in a quite absolute, final way. What you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what will get you up in the morning, what you will do with your evenings, how you will spend your weekends, what you read and who you know, what breaks your heart, and what amazes you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything." So yes, we believe that love can fix what is broken in our criminal justice system. We believe in the words of Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit paleontologist and mystic, that love is the most universal, the most tremendous, and the most mysterious of cosmic forces. Consider the opposite of love. The opposite of love is not so much a retributive eye-for-an-eye justice system, but rather indifference to the impact of such a system on victims, survivors, offenders, on all of us. Too many people of good faith are simply uninformed about our system, and therefore they are indifferent. So let me add one more restorative justice essential to the fore: courage. We who advocate for a justice that restores must have the courage to inform the indifferent about the hard facts. In the United States, over 6 million people are under correctional supervision. They're in jail, in prison, on probation, or parole. In our country, every year, over 200,000 teens and children are tried as adults. This morning, 50,000 men woke up and began another day in solitary confinement. In his recent New Yorker article entitled "The Caging of America," Adam Gopnik wrote of solitary confinement, "Go lock yourself in your bathroom and then imagine that you have to stay there for 10 years, and you will have some sense of the experience." But these numbers are small compared to the number of victims and survivors and their families. The majority of both victims and survivors are people of color and poor. And speaking of opposites, we know that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's justice. A justice that enables restorative dialogues, offender accountability, and the healing those dialogues can begin. A justice that restores. So yes, the restorative justice essentials are, from both sides of crime, from all sides, respect, graciousness, forgiveness, love, and the fifth essential, courage. But we need a courage that empowers us to do more than just speak about the hard facts to the indifferent. We need a bigger-hearted courage. 2 weeks ago, the tireless Sister Helen Prejean of Dead Man Walking fame came through LA on her 25-year-long campaign to end the death penalty. She said that friends have asked her, when is she going to stop giving 200-plus talks a year? Sister Helen answers by reference to Moses in the burning bush. She reminds us that Moses, who was living a comfortable life at the time, suddenly faced a burning bush, on fire but not consumed. From that bush, he heard God telling him, "I have heard the cry of my people." His people were hurting, and Moses needed to do something about it. His heart became on fire, but not consumed. So Sister Helen answers her friends, "My heart is on fire for the people impacted by crime." She hears her cry, and even after 25 years, her heart is not consumed. So we need a bigger-hearted courage. We need hearts that are on fire to help victims and survivors of crime to heal and for their own deeper healing to forgive. To rescue our children and our teens rather than throw their lives away. And to stop the death penalty in California this year. This year. So let me end. I'd like to end with a gospel story about starting at 1. In the Gospel of St. John, the 4th Gospel, we're given the story of the Last Supper. It is a version strikingly, even shockingly different from the story in the other 3 Gospels. Unlike the other Gospels, John makes no reference to Jesus giving himself in the form of bread and wine. Instead, the Gospel of John tells the story this way. Jesus, knowing that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and wiped them with the towel that was tied around him. So, in John's Gospel, the central moment, the Eucharist in John's Gospel, is Jesus in work clothes, bent over, washing men's feet. A poet wrote of this scene, Jesus took off the mantle of privilege and he put on the apron of service. So on behalf of this gathering, on your behalf, and on my behalf, our initial answer to Father Nicholas's question about the future is this. We imagine a Jesuit law school that will graduate lawyers who embrace the principles of restorative justice. Lawyers who teach those principles by working every day to promote respect, graciousness, forgiveness, and love. Lawyers and those whose lives they touch, who have hearts that burn, to take off the mantle of privilege and put on the apron of service. Thank you.